Yes,
Okay.
You are adequately in Canada with the Canada suka.
I'm a Canadian. What can I tell you?
So
Amish.
Okay, this is the
I have to
entrance.
mute
We
my
give
phone.
entrance now
I
to.
have to mute my phone.
so we give entrance to the public, okay? And
Yeah.
we'll start in
Can
3
we
more
still
minutes.
talk to each other while everyone is in?
No.
No.
Okay, so we just say that I'm gonna collect all the questions we're gonna send in the chat and put it in a shared document with Diego and Lea, right?
Yes, and we'll pick the questions and at the end for a discussion. So we'll read the questions. So they will send them privately to the host, so won't be conversations among the people, and we'll let you know. We'll read you the questions, or we'll let people say them when we'll open the floor for discussion. Okay?
So I admit the people, right?
Yes.
Okay, so people are going to enter. Please
Good
be
luck.
ready. Eh, que decirle que lo vamos a hacer por Facebook también, que intente el Facebook de Mamuta. Estamos nosotros en Spotlight. Espérate.
Hörde du dem?
Okay, so you didn't hear us, right? We start again.
Okay, so thank you all for joining us in the first public event of 2021. Sorry for the short delay. I'm Lea Mauas, artist, curator, and director of the Mamuta Art and Research Center.
I'm Diego Rotman, artist, curator, and senior lecturer at the Department of Theater Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem.
And together we are the Sala-manca group, and with this exhibition, Permanent Residence, we are marking 20 years of artistic practice.
Today's panel is very special. We are proud to have two fabulous guests, Professor Galit Hasan-Rokem and Professor Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett. Both have been inspiring and influential figures throughout our practice, and each of them entered our life in different ways many years ago.
They are both frequent visitors to our museum, wonderful scholars and models of engaged people. So thank you so much for being with us tonight. The structure of this evening will be as follows. Diego and I will make a short introduction, as we are doing it right now, to the current exhibition Permanent Residency and to the Museum of the Contemporary in order to contextualize Galit and Barbara's talks. After our introduction, Galit and Barbara will talk for about 30 minutes each, and at the end we'll open the floor for questions. We ask you to write the questions in the chat directly to us. You will see you can write them to Shahar and also to whom you are addressing your question, and we'll pick some of the questions that at the end by the speakers that they will address them, and it will be followed by a discussion.
But before we start, we would like to thank the wonderful artists that collaborated with us, Brian Ohad, who painted the Kingston Sukkah, Ktura Manor, who created the model of the Kingston Sukkah and painted the replica of the Deller Sukkah, Adi Kaplan and Shahar Carmel, who painted the Soberman's painting collection and the model of the Deller Sukkah.
And also, of course, to all our supporters and collaborators, the Department of the Theater Studies at the Hebrew University, Hansen House, the Ministry of Culture, the Jerusalem Foundation, the Jewish Studies Program and Cultural Studies Program at Queen's University in Ontario, the Regina Rosen Visiting Artist Fellowship, Queen's University, the Jerusalem Municipality, Rose Ostrovsky, the Kronhild Pletka Foundation, and the Pais Cultural Council.
And big thanks also to the Mamuta staff, Shahar Bin Nun, who is helping us tonight, Shimri Hagai, Amir Boltzmann, and Yoav Fish.
And last but not least, our thanks to our kids, Ashu and Nawel, for being with us and for being such great partners in our adventures. So about the Museum of the Contemporary.
Yeah.
The Museum of the Contemporary opened its doors for the first time in 2012 at the Isa Manun Daniela Pasal House in Ein Karem, where we served as directors, curators, performers, and guards. The art critic Arturo Maure wrote, "If according to Mansfeld's architectural plan, the Israel Museum structure was inspired by an Arab village and built on the ruins of the village Sheikh Badr, and the Museum of the Contemporary is in itself an Arab house located in a village that had turned into a memorial museum of an Arab village, it follows that the Israel Museum is a souvenir of the Museum of the Contemporary."
Today, the Museum of the Contemporary is located at Mamuta Art and Research Center in the Hansen House, Jerusalem, the former leper hospital, Jesus Hilfe, founded by the Moravian Church in 1887. The MOFC, the Museum of the Contemporary, is an institution or a para-institution, a framework, a platform that is dynamic, elastic, and rebellious. It is defined by its changing content. The MOFC might be acting or performing its museology with other names and in different places, some things all at once. There is no main branch, but there is at least one department, the ethnographic department, which has a collection of ethnographic made objects.
MOFC's objects can be exhibited and easily demuseologized, performing other roles. The displaced sukkah can become again a ritual object, as can the Shabbos candles. The museum can become a house, a home, and a sukkah can house the museum. Every replica becomes an original. The Portuguese-Argentinian poet João Delgado coined the name of the Museum of the Contemporary. He wrote in his diary,
During my visit in Buenos Aires to the modest home of the Oxter family, a lower middle-class family, I saw on a wall of the living room Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. That was my first visit to the Museum of the Contemporary.
The mosque is being constantly rethought through practice and discourse. Today's panel in the Soberman's Digital Salon is another moment of layering and conceptualizing the museum and its current exhibition. So some words about the current show. Over the past 6 years, we have acquired, dismantled, assembled, and transported various temporary structures, created unauthorized replicas, searched for doubles of ourselves, and relocated our home in our search for a temporary homeland.
In August 2018, we moved to Canada for an indefinite period of time to continue this search. We began the transition with a garage sale to sell off our personal objects as our departure approached. The sale took the form of an exhibit at the Kfar Saba City Gallery.
In Kingston, Ontario, we rented the only furnished house we could find. The Sobermans, the owners of the house, had died at the beginning of the previous decade, and their children had put the home up for long-term rentals as is, a kind of family museum with the 60s decor just as their parents had left it. We lived in the house for a year inside the set of another family.
The Soberman's arts collection included more than 40 paintings, mostly reproductions of well-known artworks and some originals by non-canonical artists. When we returned to Israel, we commissioned the great artists and friends, Adi Kaplan and Shachar Carmel, to reproduce the paintings from the collection down to their frames.
In the present exhibition, the Soberman collection is presented in the framework of an installation reproducing the Soberman family living room. The installation also includes a piano, which our daughter practiced on occasionally during the exhibition opening hours. A video works in the exhibition documents fragments of day-to-day life, family life in Kingston, our children's cultural acclimatation, forays into nature, and musings about migration and identity, as well as the construction of our last sukkah.
We built a sukkah in the yard of our house in Kingston, but contrary to the custom of dismantling the sukkah after the end of the holiday, we left our sukkah standing throughout the entire year, exposed to the extreme change in weather. At the end of the winter, we invited Canadian painter Brian Ohad to paint the snowy absentee landscapes of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on the walls of the sukkah, and thus to commemorate the frozen Lake Ontario on the wall traditionally designated for an image of Jerusalem, the Mizrach.
We shipped the sukkah with the Canadian landscapes to Jerusalem as a gazebo in order to install it as an ethnographic object at the Hansen House. The exhibition continues in the basement floor where Mamuta is located and where we find other works that function in our idea and plan as footnotes to the works of the first floor. The works in the basement were exhibited in different frameworks between 2014 and 2020. They broaden, enrich, and allow new readings of the works on the upper floor while also functioning as autonomous works. Galit Hasan-Rokem will refer to some of those works in her talk, so we'll only refer to them briefly. There is the Deller Sukkah and a film that's
documenting the construction of the replica as well as our family research and road trips to Fishach. And there are the Sukkot models, the Eternal Sukkah model and the Kingston Sukkah model commissioned to Ktura Manor. This is the Kingston Sukkah. This is the the model of the Deller Sukkah painted by Adi Kaplan and Shachar Carmel. And this is the model of the Eternal Sukkah, the Jewish Bedouin Sukkah, also constructed by Tura Manor, the model.
There is also the Eternal Sukkah documentary about all that project of the project done with the Al-Korshan Bedouin family. And last, Jerusalem, an iron sign from a garbage municipal container at Mishmarot Street, Musrara, Jerusalem. It first was exhibit at the Ministry of Culture Awards 2017 at the Ashdod Museum this year, January, August 2020. Well, it's last year, as a matter of fact. So now we'll turn to our guests, and we have the great pleasure and honor to introduce Galit Hasan-Rokem.
Galit Hasan-Rokem is Max and Margaret Grunwald Professor Emerita of Folklore and Professor Emerita of Hebrew Literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, cultural editor of the Palestine-Israel Journal, poet and translator. Welcome, Galit, and thanks for joining us.
Good evening. I'll share my screen, right? Okay. Good evening. This is a story about travel, more exactly about travel in circles of time and space. But let me begin with thanking the hosts, artists and friends, Lea Mauas and Diego Rotman, for generously inviting me here, whatever that means just now, and thanking Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, mentor, exemplar, and friend, for sharing this performance venue, whatever that means. Dear audience, wherever you are, I should begin with an explication of the title of this talk. The Wandering Jew is the most popular and widely distributed legendary personification of the Jews in European culture for nearly a millennium. The earliest versions of the tale that explains this tradition can be found in medieval, early 13th century chronicles of monasteries in Italy and Britain, such as this one from St. Albans in Hertfordshire, about 30 kilometers northwest of London. It represents the encounter on the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem of Jesus and the man that will become the wandering Jew. Jesus is walking towards Golgotha, from now the site of the Holy Sepulchre, carrying the cross on which he has been sentenced to die. The wandering Jew is a man who refused to let the carrier of the cross rest on the wall of his home, punished in Jesus' words, "I shall rest, but you will not rest until I return," which is written on this one. I don't know if I can show you here on the banner. This sentence is the key element of the legend that spread all over Europe. The earliest versions of this narrative, non-canonical, not included in the New Testament, do not emphasize the Jewish identity of the figure, rather his conversion to Christianity. From the early 17th century, in German language versions of the tale, the man is given the name Aswer and is identified as a shoemaker who stood in the crowd of Jerusalemites loudly calling, crucify him, as written in the gospel. The tale spread in practically every European language, peaking in huge numbers of editions in 17th and 18th century chapbooks that added to the account of the meeting on the Via Dolorosa, reports of the wandering Jews' arrival in various European cities. He often carried news of wars and calamities and was supposed to visit every place on earth before the second coming of Jesus. From the Romantic literature on, and especially in the 19th and 20th century literatures, the figure emerges as the personification of individualism and insurgence of rebellion. He also becomes, to a greater and greater extent, identified with the Jewish people living in spaces of dispersal. I borrow this versatile term from Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett's 1994 essay, where it is introduced to tone down the traumatic associations linked with the term diaspora. In the 20th century, Asver, the wandering Jew, often represents the dynamic and creative spirit that moderns imagine as the most typical characteristic of modernity. The Sukkah, the temporary structure commemorating the desert wandering of the Israelites led by Moses, ritually inhabited as an alternative home during the festival of Sukkot, intuitively qualifies as the home of the wandering Jew. Like the wandering Jew, the Sukkah exists in a cyclical rather than a linear dimension of time. Like him, the Sukkah is a highly adaptive phenomenon. Like Ahasver, who spontaneously knows the language of every place that he visits, the Sukkah emerges in styles and materials from the diverse natural environments where Jews have lived and live. The Sukkah thus often serves, in the very useful term coined by Barbara's colleague, Mary Louise Pratt, as a contact zone, which she coined in her 1991 lecture and defined it as a social space where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in context of highly asymmetrical relations of power. The hosts to this event, I don't know why you're, here it is. The hosts of this event are Lea Mauas and Diego Rothman, whom you see on the screen, also known as the artists group Sala-manca, a name that, in addition of honoring an ancient seat of learning in Spain, may also mean a missing hall or room, una sala manca in Spanish. This recalls the ritual structure sukkah, a collapsible chamber. One may say that Sala-manca have adapted the sukkah as a favorite material object to think with about home, wandering, contact zones, spaces of dispersal, and identity. Sala-manca sukkahs are, like all sukkot, ephemeral and made of relatively unstable materials, but being foldable, they can also be stored, as they usually are, and re-emerge cyclically every year anew for the holiday they were designed for. So ephemeral, but also transcendent and eternal, which is another name for the wandering Jew, the eternal Jew, especially in the German tradition where he goes mainly by the name Der ewige Jude. By the way, the brand name of a commercially distributed sukkah kit is exactly that, Eternal Sukkah. That kit used to be the first Google hit on the word combination Eternal Sukkah until Sala-manca. Now the first hit is a Sala-manca project. I'm reading from a description of this project in the group's website. In 2014, Sala-manca Group, founders and artistic directors of the Mamuta Art and Media Center, were invited by the Hansen House in Jerusalem to create an innovative sukkah. Rather than construct an extravagant new sukkah, the artists decided to delve into the sukkah's charged meaning in the Israeli context, proposing a contemporary reading of the sukkah as both concrete object and symbol. The artists' search took them to the Palestinian territories to meet with members of the Al-Korhan family of the Jahalin Bedouin tribe. The Jahalin live in the Judean desert, Khan al-Ahmar, not connected to the water or electricity grid, in temporary structures built with found materials, iron and wood taken from construction sites, aluminum from water heaters, etc. and under constant threat of demolition and displacement by Israel's civil administration. Consequently, they dismounted, here you can see the structure in its Jahalin setting. They dismounted the structure in one night while the owners built another one so that in the morning the change would not be found out by the civil administration. Sala-manca, with artists Itamar Mendes-Flor and Yeshayahu Rabinovich, identified this home that you see on the screen, doubly temporary because of the inhabitants' semi-nomadic lifestyle on one hand, and the threat of demolition and displacement on the other hand, as their innovative contemporary sukkah made of found materials. They bought it from the owners and moved it to the Hansen House garden, integrating several meanings into the sukkah object. The Israelites wandering in the desert and fleeing the house of bondage, and the oppression and displacement inflicted on Palestinians, in this case, the Jahalim family by the Israeli society to which the artists belong. Whereas this sukkah, now adequately covered by palm leaf roof, primarily gestured toward the present situation, an aspect of future was added to its performance as a sukkah in the garden of Beit Hansen, as discussions were conducted by social activists, planners, and artists on the prospects of Bedouin life in Israel and the occupied territories, and on housing shortage in Israel, particularly in Jerusalem. If the story ended here, it would already be amazing. I now quote Diego Rothman's article on this sukkah. The next step in the project, as decided by the artists, was merchandising the sukkah as an art piece. This act consisted of several critical gestures addressing the politics and economy of art and the exclusion of several groups from the canonizing institutions of art in Israel. To make a long story short, the eternal sukkah of the Jahalin was purchased by the Israel Museum, exhibited, and that's what you see in the lower panel of this screen, and then incorporated in its permanent collections. The whole process was crowned by a panel discussion at the Israel Museum, including a representative of the Jahalin, and a month later, a day tour of Jahalin kids in the museum. I often wonder whether the members of the Jahalin community have visited the Israel Museum since then. Instead, more displacements and dispossessions are reported, brutally lacking similar acts of mutual respect and compensation, as in the Sala-manca case, where the the money that was paid by the museum to the artists was shared equally with the Jahalin. In addition to the title Eternal, this sukkah shares with the Wandering Jew also another fundamental trait, namely, it accumulates new layers of meaning by moving from one place to another. The home of the Al-Kurshans in Khan al-Ahmar, built from construction waste, to the innovative sukkah in the Hansen House, funded by the Jerusalem municipality, and to the piece of contemporary art in the collection of the Israel Museum. In its wanderings, this object crosses boundaries of function and signification, national and political borders, diverse positions of status, dispossession, subjection, authority, and hegemony. The parallel of Sukkah and Wandering Jew also reveals new meanings in the legendary figure of the Wandering Jew. As an unveiled vision of the relationship between the Israeli occupation and the occupied Palestinians opens new perspectives and horizons of the homelessness and wandering of Jews. Such are the ethical questions resulting from inflicting on one's neighbors the same kind of deprivation as one, in this case, the collective subject of Israeli Jews, experiences as the cause of one's own hurt. And I will not have the time to discuss here the reasons why and how we have ended up in this situation. As I said, Sala-manca have made the sukkah into a Denkfigur, a figure of thought, to use a concept created by Walter Benjamin. It is for them a constant medium for investigating socio-cultural situations as well as private life events. Their art is deeply inspective and analytical. It constructs out of exploration and contemplation. The following sukkah that I shall discuss gestures clearly toward the past. We return to the Israel Museum, where you can see the 19th century sukkah of the Deller family from Fischach in southern Germany, richly and colorfully renovated. Unlike the Jahalin sukkah that was exhibited in the contemporary art department, the Fischach sukkah is part of the museum's large Judaica department, focusing on Jewish ritual art, and is visibly shown in the permanent exhibition. The sukkah ignited the creative imagination of the Sala-mancas, an imagination that when it burns bright, produces, of course, wandering. In fact, in their case, wandering Jews. So the entire family, Leah, Diego, Ashu, and Noel, landed in Fischach and conducted some serious historical and ethnographical research that led to the production of a replica of the 19th century sukkah, a 21st century Mamuta sukkah with some small but significant changes, some of which I will mention. In this detail, in black and white, can you see the whole picture? Okay. In this detail of the Deller sukkah at the Israel Museum, you may see Mrs. Deller standing at the door, opening her home, and a skyline of houses with chimneys, the tallest one emitting smoke. In this detail of the Deller sukkah at Mamuta, you will find no Mrs. Deller at her door, and a skyline of houses and a church tower in place of the smoking chimney of the old Deller sukkah. As Sala-manca actually saw the church in Fischach, the question arises, who replaced the church with a smoking chimney with all its associations? Diego Rothman will, in a forthcoming article, elaborate on this topic. The Mamuta Deller sukkah has accumulated the travel experience of its creators, including the loud absence of the Jews in the post-World War II era South German town, the humans that are not present in this picture. And a church tower, a couple of house rows behind the Deller home, a structure that for some reason is not represented in the earlier version. Traveling Jews and Sukkot intersect differently in the two cases. The Museum Deller Sukkah traveled from Germany to Israel, smuggled as late as 1937 by Mrs. Berta Frenkel upon her immigration as a refugee, or rather an escapee from Nazi Germany, to become the representation of European Jewish Sukkot at the probably most representative exhibition of Jewish ritual objects in the world. The Mamuta Deller Sukkah was built in Jerusalem with local materials after the artist's trip to Fischach, from where they brought along their impressions of the city that they imprinted on their version of the Sukkah. The two versions are thus two possible transformations of spaces of dispersal, of transfer between the continents, and the contact zone between religions, also of modes of extinction and of survival, and of memory and erasure. The stay of Sala-manca and family in Canada that produced the present exhibition also produced a sukkah that stood in the yard of their home, a temporary home within their already temporary home in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, as we heard. The interior of which can be seen in their present exhibition at the Hansen House in Jerusalem. The Canada Sukkah, in which Barbara, who is from Canada, is sitting, as you can see. The Canada Sukkah embodies another phase in the artist's thinking about home, spaces of dispersal and contact zones. The interior, painted by a local painter as a snowy landscape, empty of humans except for the visiting family, is an interesting reversal of inside and outside. It follows the model of the South German sukkah that projected the closest outdoor environment of the town of Fischach on the interior walls of their sukkah. The empty snow landscape, now set in the Mamuta exhibition space in Jerusalem, communicates perhaps Canadian themes. On one hand, Canada is one of the sparsest populated countries in the world, and on the other hand, Kingston is located in one of the most densely populated regions of the country. This echoes issues revealed in the earlier Sukkot of Sala-manca, such as the inequities between indigenous populations and newer ones, between majority and minority cultures, and territorial belonging versus violent uprooting. Like the wandering Jew who speaks the local language wherever he arrives, Sala-manca again translate a new environment into their most recent sukkah, integrating it into familiar structures, namely the architecture of the Deller Sukkah, the space of the Hansen House, and the city of Jerusalem. This adaptation, or ecotype, as folklorists call it, draws attention to a series of inspiring paradoxes. The sukkah is a constant temporary resident that can be moved from one country to another without much changing it. Whereas the family's rented bourgeois salon, exhibited next to the Canada sukkah, seemingly the epitome of stable continuation, is actually more temporary and can only be represented at the Museum of the Contemporary by substitute objects based on photographs, yet another mediation by visual effect. Snow in Jerusalem arouses rich associations for persons that grew up in the city. Carnivalesque days off from school and family rollicking outside the set cycles of life. For me, it brings flashes of memories from a childhood in another remote corner of Earth, that being round by definition has no corners. That is Finland, the land of Santa Claus, if you want a ritual reference to that country. The Sala-manca sukkahs defeat their fate of appearance and disappearance in the annual ritual cycle as art exhibited independent of that cycle. Let us return with them to Jerusalem, to the 130 years old building of the Hansen House, earlier the Hansen Hospital for those afflicted with Hansen's disease, also known as leprosy. When established by a German noblewoman under the auspices of the German Church, later specifically the Moravian Order, its services embraced patients of all denominations, Jews, Christians, though mainly Muslims. The hospital was named Help of Jesus, Jesus Hilfe, as you may see, still engraved above the main entrance. This brings us back to the encounter between Jesus and the wandering Jew on the Via Dolorosa, where they parted in bitter discord. However, both were men of eternal sorrows, as the prefiguration of the Messiah is described by the prophet Isaiah. Ish machovot ve'yadua choli, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, or in Luther's German translation, voller Schmerzen und Krankheit. This image, as well as the image of Jesus the physician, current in Christian writings, inspired the name of the hospital, which has now turned into a municipal art center that houses, among others, the juggler artists of many names, Museum of the Contemporary, Sala-manca, Mamuta, all in one. The concept of a man of sorrows who is acquainted with pain and disease appears also in Jewish images of the Messiah, as shown in this just fragment of a tale that I'll show you from the Babylonian Talmud, where an ailing and suffering Messiah is waiting for his cue to fulfill his redemptive mission. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi encountered Elijah the prophet standing at the grave of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. He, the rabbi, said to him, Elijah, when will the Messiah come? He replied to him, go ask him himself. Where does he sit? At the gate of Rome. And what is his sign by which I will recognize him? He sits among the poor, suffering from diseases, and all of them loosen and tighten all their bandages at one time. And he loosens one and tightens it, and then another and another, saying, perhaps I will be required, and this way I won't delay. This is Babylonian Talmud Tractate Sanhedrin, and the translation is Daniel Boyarin's. And maybe, I say, maybe the poor and the sick banished from the city to its gate were lepers, but that is another story. I want to conclude on a personal note, with the Museum of the Contemporary and its exhibitions in mind. In 2016, the artist Reuven Zehavi exhibited his art at Mamuta under the title China. The pieces exhibited were disposable plates staged as china with delicate monochrome paintings of Isawiya, the large Palestinian neighborhood on the northeastern slopes of Mount Scopus, the site of the academic home for some of us interwoven in this story. Telling the tale of the relationship between Isawiya and the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus would require another hour, and it's rich, complex, and interesting. But allow me to postpone it for now. The 3 Isawiya plates that we acquired are now, as you can see, at 3 sites of dispersal, functioning as specimens of another ritual object of commemoration, slightly different than the sukkah, namely the Mizrach, literally the east, the imagined direction of Jerusalem, following an East European tradition to make Jerusalem omnipresent in Jewish homes. Unlike the sukkah, they decorate everyday life with a peculiar combination of presence and absence. Where the Mizrach is, Jerusalem exists imagined in dreams, perhaps in memories. These plates evoke a family situated in 3 cities, considerable flight hours apart, and in the no place heterotopy site of the WhatsApp group that we call Jerusalem, Chicago, Seattle. This symbol of Jerusalem on the eastern walls in the homes of our family marks the awareness of the coexistence of our lives in spaces of dispersal and the pain of the bleeding contact zone of Isawiya facing Mount Scopus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Galit. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And please, you are all invited to send your questions through the chat to Shahar Ben Nun. She wrote to everybody now, so you can see. And at the end of Barbara's presentation, we'll open the conversation with your questions to Galit and to Barbara. So thank you again, Galit. And now We are delighted and honored to present Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett.
Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett is University Professor Emerita and Professor Emerita of Performance Studies at New York University, and Ronald Lauder, Chief Curator, Core Exhibition at the POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews. Thanks a lot, Barbara, for joining us this evening and this midday for you.
Thank you very, very much. I'm delighted to be here. First of all, I cannot think of anyone I would rather share this event with than Galit. I'm a great admirer, pardon me, and we've known each other for a very, very long time. So I want to thank Galit for her wonderful presentation. And of course, I am maybe, if not the greatest fan, at least in my own eyes, the greatest fan of Sala-manca and all the work that you do. So I thank you for this opportunity as well. Now I'm going to share my screen, and I think that, let's see, I hope that this will come up properly. Yes. So I have, pardon me, renamed my presentation to A Life in the Meta-Museological Lane on the Museum of the Contemporary. And I take as an inspiration for my comments on the current exhibition, but on the museum more generally, a statement that's attributed to Clifford Geertz. And that is, it is the copying that originates. It is the copying that originates. And I take the Museum of the Contemporary, the current project, the earlier projects, as a way to rethink what I would call iteration, and what Leah and Diego referred to as doubling. And it's an opportunity to rethink those terms. They take us, that rethinking can take us in some very, very interesting directions. And so it's a thinking that maybe starts with a more familiar terms, the terms of originals and copying, or originals and copies, because that thinking tends to fetishize, or that language, that discourse tends to fetishize what I would call firsts, original, if you will, the first, if you will, instantiation, and treats all iterations as somehow rather lesser than those, quote, firsts, because of a privileging of the original material and its singularity and its unreproducibility as original. In other words, the whole language of originals and copies is very, very, very limiting. And I think that the work of the Museum of the Contemporary is to put pressure on that kind of language and on that kind of fetishizing of firsts, which are defined in terms of their original material, and the unreproducibility of that original, of the original, in the sense of its materiality. So we want to put pressure on that, and that I think is, and also on how productive it is to stop thinking in that way. So what I would argue is that that way of thinking is itself an artifact, literally an artifact, of the advent of mechanical reproduction, and even more so in our time of digital media. I don't even use the word reproduction here, but of digital media. In other words, I'd like us to rethink our language, a language that goes in the direction of the virtual, of simulation. I have more terms that I'll introduce. I'd like us to rethink our language so that we think rather in terms of the, what I would call the actuality of new kinds of objects. And that, I think, is really at the heart of the kinds of objects that Sala-manca creates for and at the Museum of the Contemporary. So let me go to what I would call iteration. And there are many terms that are used, and they have different valences. And it would be worth a whole discussion just of those terms. So what are some of the terms for iteration, what I call iteration, and perhaps what Sala-manca calls doubling. And that is, here are some of them: replication, reconstruction, reproduction, replica, copy, facsimile, simulation, virtual. There are others. We could include restoration. There are many others as well. All of these terms tend to fetishize the materiality of the object that is being replicated, reconstructed, reproduced, replicated, etc. And all of these terms tend to locate the singularity of the original in the irreproducibility of its materiality. And that is the wonderful intervention of Sala-manca. They are intervening precisely in that assumption. And it's this assumption actually that precipitated the introduction of the category of intangible heritage by UNESCO, which is another whole conversation. So the way I like to think here is that in all of the, if you will, artifacts or objects that are created through iteration, they actually, this is a way of creating what I would call new actualities, not virtualities, but new actualities, new objects and new kinds of objects, and new kinds of value, and new kinds of efficacy and agency. And I think the Bedouin Sukkah is probably the single best example of that, but we'll come to that in a moment. So I want to really shift from a term that I think has very little value and is absolutely overused, which is, if you will, the virtual, and also this idea of simulation as some kind of, I would say, a sort of nightmare scenario in the world of the digital. And I want to work towards the idea that these iterations are, that I want to think in terms of actuality, new kinds of objects, new kinds of value, new kinds of efficacy, new kinds of agency. So there are two approaches that we can take to this set of issues. And I want to start, one of them I call materiality, and the other I call copying that originates. Well, they both are, but I want to start with the issue of materiality. And I want to start with two examples that were very inspiring for my way of approaching the Museum of the Contemporary. And I want to start with the Ise Jingju Shrine. This is a shrine that says of itself that it is 800 years old, but never more than 20 years old, because every 20 years it is destroyed in order to have to rebuild it, because the value the value here is placed in the knowledge of how to build it, not in the original material from which it was originally built. In other words, the materiality of this shrine is not what defines it. What defines it is the knowledge of how to build it. And the value lies in the transmission of that knowledge. And the only way to transmit that knowledge is to do it, to actually rebuild it. In other words, the knowledge lies, if you will, in an archive, which is it is embodied knowledge. In other words, the body is the archive, and the transmission of that knowledge is a transmission that, if you will, re-embodies it in the bodies of those who will now carry the knowledge of how to build it. And the result of that process is, in fact, the physical shrine in new materials, but through the performance and through the transmission of embodied knowledge. And we really, without directly referencing this Japanese tradition, it was the basis for what we did at POLIN Museum when we worked with Hans House Studio in Massachusetts, whose motto, whose mission is to recover lost objects. Now, in this case, the object is gone, so it's not like the Diller Sukkah or the Kingston Sukkah, this is an instance where all that remains is the documentation, and that the process of recovering the knowledge of how to build this Gvozdets synagogue from the 16th and 17th century and 18th century when it was renovated, that process, it was a process of working with traditional tools, materials, and techniques to recover the knowledge of how to build it by building it. And the result was a materialization of that knowledge. So this is, I would say, just as the Jingju Shrine is a new object that is 800 years old, so too here is this a new kind of object. It is not a copy of something. It is not a double. It is actually something new that has value, that its value lies in the knowledge that was recovered from the way in which it was constructed. So this is these were my starting points in trying to think about what the Museum of the Contemporary has done with the Kingston residence, the Kingston Sukkah, the Deller Sukkah, the Bedouin Sukkah. Now, so the first has to do with this fetishizing of the original material and trying to move away from that way of thinking. And the second principle has to do with this idea that the copying originates. Now, of course, these examples, I would say, are not examples of copying as such, but they are examples of creating something that is as original as the first iteration. So let me go now to the idea that that copying originates. And here I want to work with the term that Sala-manca uses, which is the word doubling. And I quote them. They say that we, quote, acquired, dismantled, assembled, and transported various temporary structures, created unauthorized replicas, searched for doubles of ourselves, and relocated our home in our search for a temporary homeland. And we could include there also, I would say, dispossession and displacement, because those are very important for the Bedouin Sukkah. Now, what this doubling does, which I find very, very, very interesting, is number one, it blurs the line between art and life, home and museum. And we'll see that also with the garage sale. So it blurs the line between art and life, home and museum. That's the first thing. The second, that it uses what I would call slippage as a productive strategy, that it's not absolutely clear what is what. So the slippage, and we see it very much in the way in which these paintings in the original home have been, if you will, well, reproduced, I hate to use that language, but how they appear in the doubling of this home, where they are, all of them painted, whether they were original works of art or reproductions. So blurring the line between art and life, slippage is a productive strategy. The third is what I would call mirroring. And what this does, what happens with what they're called doubling and what I would call, also call mirroring, creates a kind of, the way I would describe it is a kind of infinity box of the meta-museological. And because there is a way in which each iteration is a reflection on itself and on the other iteration. So there's a kind of, I would say, infinity of reflections, which is where the mirroring becomes a kind of infinity box. And all of it is what I'm calling meta-museological. I'll say more about that in a moment. So blurring the line, slippage, mirroring, and then location, dislocation, relocation, so that the placement and the locating of these iterations become critically important to what they become in each instance. And then finally, which for me is what all of this kind of, if you will, adds up to, or perhaps better said, doesn't add up to, is the unresolvability of what has been created. In other words, that is that this kind of work, this kind of artistic practice, curatorial practice, ethnographic practice is a way of holding the ontological status and meaning of what has been created in suspension. So there's a way in which these works will not resolve. They are profoundly unresolvable. Their ontological status and meaning are unstable and are held in suspension. And that, I think, is what makes these works so incredibly powerful, and not without a touch of irony. So now, and I want to place this work in, let me just see, I want to place this work in a wider artistic context. In other words, this is work, Sala-manca's work finds the museological potential in everyday life and finds everyday life in the museological. And so this is what I mean by living in the meta-museological lane. And a question I will have for Diego and Leah is, what's that actually like? So as far as the garage sale that Sala-manca created, there's a video of it on their website. It's really in the tradition of, I would say, institutional critique and performance art. And an early, perhaps the first example of it is Martha Rossler's traveling garage sale at the Art Gallery of the University of California, restaged, that was in 1973, restaged at MoMA. And it is, basically at the time, it was introduced as a kind of institutional critique of the museum. And that, I think, is very much what the Bedouin Sukkah does in its own way. So one context within, if you will, a wider set of artistic practices would be to place the garage sale there. The second is that Sala-manca has embedded its, I would say, its doubling of the home in Kingston and of the various sukkahs. But the Kingston sukkah and the home, they have embedded those doublings in a meta-museological travel narrative that would be lived within the slippage of life and art. And so I'm referring now to the Soberman House, which is a kind of an Airbnb as a museum of itself. And just one second, let me just, here it is, as it has been installed at Hansen House. But it too is within a wider history of these, I would say, of these kinds of doublings. And one of the most interesting ones is the Salon de Fleurus, a contemporary reconstruction. Again, I don't like the language, but let's put it this way: a contemporary doubling or iteration of Gertrude Stein's Parisian Salon with a live-in host, and with everything here, an original sepia, quote, copy of what had been in Stein's salon. And this artist has also done this with the Florine Stettheimer collection and in miniature. So there are precedents for this way of working, but what Sala-manca has done is really unique in its own right because of the very particular way in which they live in and with these doublings and in their locating, dislocating, and relocating of them. Now, what I found absolutely fascinating about the Kingston Sukkah. So, first of all, being a Canadian, I have to say, to make a kind of a personal remark here, and that is, when I heard that Diego and Leah and their kids were going to be in Kingston for a year, I thought to myself, well, that sounds really bland. why Kingston? Why Canada? Why Kingston? What are they going to do there? How are they going to make something interesting out of that? Well, to my astonishment, they've made something absolutely extraordinary and absolutely fascinating. And it is this act of curatorial and artistic imagination to be able to find, if you will, I wouldn't even call it museological, the meta-museological in what I would have thought of as a most unpromising situation. Maybe because I'm so familiar with it, that it didn't look very promising to me until I saw what they did with it. So what I found especially interesting here, there are a couple of issues. One is that they could not transport the sukkah as an art object. They had to transport it as a gazebo, or even as, I would say, construction material, to be able to get it from Kingston to Jerusalem. So I think that, in other words, they had to devalue it. So rather than, if you will, elevating a humble structure as a work of art, they had to devalue a work of art in order to be able to relocate it to Jerusalem. The second is that when they revalued it, they did it as they have done in many other cases. They revalued it as a, quote, ethnographic object. And this is something I think would be really, really interesting to discuss. Why, why do they prefer to think about this object and others as ethnographic objects rather than as art objects? Although when acquired by the Israel Museum, I do believe that the museum did not, it's a question. Did the Israel Museum treat it as an ethnographic object, or did the Israel Museum treat it as an art object? So that for me is a very, very interesting issue, because it raises the question of where is value being located? And this has profound meaning for the life museum divide and the art life divide, and it is linked to the naming of the institution as the Museum of the Contemporary, because what this does is invoke a very important distinction which Johannes Fabian makes between the contemporary and the contemporaneous, being a very important, it's a very important intervention with regard to ethnographic writing and ethnographic thinking. In other words, it's a way of introducing time and understanding the way in which ethnographic objects are constituted as somehow or other being contemporaneous without being contemporary, being somehow or other, I would say, held in suspension in the ethnographic present, which is time out of time. And by making such so-called ethnographic objects contemporary, it puts them in time and into our present. So they are not only contemporaneous, but also in time, and time that actually unfolds. So I'd be very interested in that aspect. Now, also interesting is the relationship between their one-to-one doubles and their miniature doubles in the form of models. And I would be very interested in hearing more from Leah and Diego on the relationship between, if you will, the first instantiation, then the one-to-one iteration, and the miniature iteration. I want to conclude now by looking briefly at the Bedouin Sukkah, which Galit talked about so very eloquently. And I find this really, really interesting. And what's so interesting about all of the Sukkot that Sala-manca have worked with, the Dellers, the Bedouin one, the Kingston one, is that all of them were created within a narrative. They aren't just simply objects that were doubled, but they are objects that are sitting within a narrative. And those narratives are very different one from the other, but they're extremely important in giving, if you will, layers of meaning and also agency to these objects. And the one I think that has the greatest agency in many ways is the first one, and that is the first one because of in all the ways that Galit has already very clearly indicated, and it has very much to do with the potential or the role of the museum as activist, as bringing attention to a situation and actually bringing an element of change to a situation through this artistic, if you will, intervention. And as to whether this is a small change, whether it has in it the seeds for a more profound change, I would say that the Bedouin Sukkah was an activist project. It in a way that's quite different from the ones that followed. Now, what's so interesting, of course, is the transvaluation from, in quotation marks, trash to treasure, or if you will, trash to temporary shelter in a semi-permanent situation for a nomadic community, and from that temporary residence to another temporary structure to a kind of permanent home in an art museum. And so here is a marvelous case of how curation and museum practices create value with irony, and value with critique of government policies vis-a-vis this community, and critique of the institution of the museum. So it's a very complex and very rich and very, very interesting object. It is, if you will, an abject object with agency. And I wonder if its permanence within the art museum is somehow rather weakens that agency, or whether it, if you will, transmutes it or gives it another platform for doing its work. So it is a very, I would argue that in this case, it's a performance that is performative in that it somehow enacts what it's actually about. And it certainly did that very powerfully when Sala-manca brought it from the desert to the Hansen House. As to how it's working with its relocation at the Israel Museum is another story. So the two other sukkahs in the years that followed, the Deller Sukkah, is fascinating in yet another way, because I would argue, and this is of course what Sala-manca argues, is that the double actually exceeds the first instantiation. I try to avoid the language of originals, copies, etc., but certainly the double exceeds the first instantiation, if only by restoring the image of the church. But also it's fascinating that the first instantiation, if you will, was about yearning for Jerusalem. And on the eve of the Holocaust, with its relocation, or its relocation to Jerusalem, it goes from yearning to being in Jerusalem to a memory of where we were. And in that way, it has a very different, if you will, narrative, and a very different way in which the doubling actually works. In other words, it goes from the past to the present by also inserting the contemporary. So it really is a whole, this is doubling but doubling in a way that's very, very different. And then finally with the Kingston Sukkah, I found it fascinating that it was left up all year. So it was located in the Canadian winter, relocated to Israel within a meta-museological narrative, and at the same time, a version, if you will, in quotation marks, of the Deller Sukkah. In other words, it really speaks to the infinity box of mirroring which goes beyond doubling. So I find this work to be extremely provocative, extremely interesting, and infinitely, I would say, rewarding to think about. So I thank Sala-manca for all the wonderful work that they do.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for the great talk. I think that after both presentations, just a second, we want to. Okay, we feel like in a type of a birthday party. We got so many compliments. So really thank you. It was not expected. So it really we are really touched, I think, and really
Yeah, absolutely, and also so many things to think about both in your presentations. But we'd love to open this also for the public for questions. We know that Ruta Cohen would like to comment, so we'll open her mic.
if we have to find her here in the. Just a second. In the meanwhile, we can answer the question, Barbara, that you made regarding the Israel Museum and how they define the sukkah as ethnographic or as was an art object. We met when we were talking with the chief curator at that time, Mira Lapidot. We had a conversation. They didn't know yet if they are going to buy it or not, and she asked us, but to which department it belongs? It's to the ethnography, to the Judaica department, or to the art department? We actually wanted them to buy, so we say to both. And, you just decide. But I think that it can. No, I think it can be placed in both.
And regarding also the agency of the object, and also regarding Galit's talk of the sukkah, now that it's in the museum, as a matter of fact, we wanted to take it out of the museum again. And we talked with the museum about that possibility. But well, it's not so easy. And it's also interesting that at the moment that it entered the museum and it did broaden the discourse or the possibility of the people to know about the community, but it's also now the object is in the storage. So that's also something that's, and we are trying to take it out from the storage.
Another story regarding what to do with the eternal sukkah. It's in a conversation when we were interviewing James Schneider, the former general director of the museum. We told him, what about actually installing it in Han al-Ahmar back? He didn't really like that idea, but.
Okay, so Ruta Cohen, it's please.
Ruth, you are on spotlight as
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you very much, Galit and Barbara, for these thought-provoking presentations. I would like to thank Galit for mentioning Bracha Berta Frankel, who was the person responsible for bringing this Deller Sukkah to Jerusalem, or first to Haifa. I am her granddaughter, and I wouldn't have mentioned it tonight, but for what Barbara said later on about the whole, which I didn't know, Diego and Lea, that the Canadian sukkah that you made, you had to define it as a construction when you brought it to Israel. My grandmother, when she brought it, it was 1937, and they left Munich to Palestine. She was alone with her 5 kids. My mother was the oldest. She was 14 years old at the time, and it was quite dangerous, the whole thing, to bring these wooden boards from that small town to Munich, and then to hid them in the boxes, in which the huge boxes, what we call in Hebrew the lifts, which she brought all the way to Palestine. It arrived much later than they arrived to Palestine. But when the Gestapo person came to the place to check those huge boxes, they saw this wooden boards, which she placed upside down, of course, that they won't see the paintings. And they asked her, my grandmother, why do you need all these many boards, or whatever you call them, luchot, we call in Hebrew, of wood? And so my grandmother was a very kind of genius person. She said, you know, we are going to the wasteland and we will not have any material from which to build our huts, she said, atzrif shelanu, yes, in Hebrew. And so I need them in order to build the place where we shall live. So you see that in the very story of the wandering Jew, to go back to Galit's ideas, wandering indeed from there to the other place, they had to lower ontologically, so to speak, the work of art into something else, which brought it back to the sukkah idea, indeed, in order to make it possible for her cousin, Dr. Feuchtwanger, to fulfill this mission and bring this sukkah to a place which was actually saving it, and that's why we have it until this day as one of the really most beautiful objects in the museum. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth.
And Galit, please, you wanted to...
Yes, I'm on. I would like to say two things. First of all, Ruth, of course, I knew it is your grandmother because of our distant family relationship and because it says so in the museum. But I want to relate to Barbara's very interesting talk, and I want to ask you, Barbara, and you, Diego and Leah, and everybody else, could we say that what Sala-manca do with art is an act of decanonizing, and by that, the models of their art is not the written or the printed, but rather the spoken, the oral. So they turn art that is in modern museums and so on, usually thought of as a canonized entity, as a fixed entity, as a written, metaphorically written entity. They turn it into an oral, which changes in transmission. And they actually do the transmission themselves and lay bare, make the process of that decanonization constantly transparent. I want to add something to my own talk that I should have said. Isawiya, the village, probably bears the name of Jesus. So we have another circle there that I need to mention. Thank you.
So thank you very much. What I would say is that, first of all, absolutely, I would agree with you. And I think it's really interesting that the work of Sala-manca, although of course they make films and video and digital photographs, but I would say the signature work is analog. It's handmade and it's very material and very, very physical. And in that way, these are, I think of them as performing objects. And that would be how I would come towards your idea of them being oral, that I would think of them as performing objects. But what I find fascinating is that they've taken, in a way, a reverse strategy. And that is that works that one would expect to be defined as art, they very strategically define, think about, present, argue for as, quote, ethnographic. This is really interesting because in a way, it is a way of, I would say, dealing with something that it's a way of recovering the value in a repudiated practice. And that is, ethnography has been critiqued in many, many ways. And the response of museums has been very much to try to elevate ethnographic, so-called ethnographic objects by treating them as art objects. So the Musée du Quai Branly, for example, it's a way, it's as if art can save ethnography from itself. And here, it's in a way, it's the opposite strategy, which is to take objects that an art museum like the Israel Museum would collect, and I can't believe they collected it thinking of it as an ethnographic object. They obviously thought about it as an art object, for sure, for sure. But the idea that one would, I would say, not.
It was exhibited as art, not as ethnography at the Israel Museum. Absolutely. It was not ethnography. And it's, I think, and correct me, Diego and Lea, if I'm wrong, but it is owned by the Department of Modern Art, Contemporary Art, not by the ethnography.
Of Israeli art, and it's also complex because of the nature of the object.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that the sort of the use of the term contemporary, the treating of these objects as, quote, ethnographic objects is very, very strategic, and it runs contrary to the way in which those terms are usually used and the sort of objects that usually come into their purview. So, but your comment is really, really interesting. And I thought when you use the word archetype, of course, this is folklore talk, but it's like, you know, honey on my heart, because it's only with another folklorist that we can have this kind of conversation. But the idea of versions and variants, which already doesn't privilege, although there is a kind of privileging of a kind of form. I mean, that's the language that's been used, that's used for oral tradition, right? Form, versions and variants.
Not anymore, not anymore, for a long time, not anymore.
Well, you know, maybe I never graduated.
So, thank you. Now we are going to invite Tanya Zimmerman. Hi, Tanya.
Hi, hello. Hello to everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for your very interesting talk and the idea of iteration reminds me of the theology of Orthodox icon. You have a prototype and you have a series of copies which don't have the same identity, but they participate on the original. So for me it was very close. I'm art historian, and of course for us also the originals are very important. It's not the same if you have Picasso's Gertrude Stein in original or a copy. There are some objects that can be replaceable and some which cannot be replaceable. But I wanted to ask you, what is the potential of such doubling, iterations, or mirroring? I think about the reenactments in art. I don't know if you know Milo Rau, but he reenacted the Ceausescu trials and the Moscow trials, and you can see them again, to re-see them, to repeat them, and to see them more conscious as when they happened for the first time. I wanted to ask you where you see the potential of such copies, which you don't want to call copies, but iterations. And the second question is, if you have in literature, you have quite a lot of stories about original and copy. Vladimir Nabokov, and in film also the students from Prague. And there's also a problem when you have a copy and original. So one of them has to be destroyed, and usually the original is destroyed in such stories. What would happen with such iterations and doubling when the original would appear, what would the museum do? These are two questions.
Wow. Galit, do you want to start?
No, you start.
Okay.
I'm thinking.
So, well, actually, there's, this is really, these are terms that I now have to add to my list. Prototypes, replacement, also forgery, plagiarism, fakes. In other words, I think this list has to get longer. And then what it means is that not all iterations are have the same ontological status. That I think, so I think your example of icons is a very, very interesting one. There could be a prototype, but the iterations do they have equal power?
Yeah, the same power they have.
The same power. So I think that all of these cases, in a way, I think if I were to try to really tease this out, I would line up instances, just as you started to do, to line them up to see where does this go. In other words, rather than one grand theory, I would work up from empirically from the instances, and then try to think more theoretically from there. But that's really very thoughtful, and thank you very much for that comment.
It's the same in literature. You have a quotation and the repeat in different contexts.
Also,
so on. There are so many different possibilities, with very creative potential.
Quotation, citation, paraphrase.
Yes.
We could. I think that accumulation of terms for iteration, I think, would take us to an interesting place.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that discussion, Tanya Zimmerman. First of all, taking up the topic of icons makes me think about the semiotic pairing of icon and index, which I think is very important in this discussion, and I think we should go on it very much, but I think it really bears forth in this discussion to think about those two things. But on the icons, there's another thing, and that's the question of charisma, right?
Yes.
An icon has to have charisma in order to work. It's like and this actually brings us to a critique of, I mentioned Walter Benjamin in another context in my talk, but I think the critique of Walter Benjamin's famous paper about art in the age of mechanical reproduction. I think Sala-manca's work is actually a very strong critique of Benjamin's discussion of the loss of charisma in the age of mechanical reproduction. Because as you said, first of all, the charisma can be infectious. It can travel. And
but this is not an industrialized reproduction, but handicraft. And this is like in an icon, it's almost a ritual, religious
I want to refer you to a volume edited by Birgitte Meyers, anthropologist from Amsterdam, on things in religion. And there are several articles there about third world religions, India and South America, and about how printed and mechanically reproduced icons become charismatic.
Yes,
and
that's right.
So it doesn't have to be made by hand in order to become charismatic in our time. I just wanted to mention, since you talked about the originals destroyed, that in several epic traditions, specifically in the Indian tradition, this motif that the original text disappears in the water or somehow disappears, and then there is a copying of all of it again, actually prophesies the fact that the original has to disappear. The original, it's like the two tablets in Sinai. The first pair had to be destroyed. It's the second that was transmitted. So there's something about the originals being too powerful in order to be reproduced in tradition.
Well, actually, the Japanese shrines have to be destroyed, and they're destroyed every 20 years. They're destroyed. But what I would say is that the Japanese shrine, the Gvozdet synagogue, and the Sala-manca sukkahs are wonderful examples of unmechanical reproduction, and which makes them very interesting and provocative.
Thank you very much, Tanya. We'll invite.
Thank you very much to you too for the inspiring talks.
Thank you. And Natalia Romik. But before I want to answer also another question that Barbara, you mentioned regarding the miniatures. Just to mention that actually we are now working on a new project that is based on puppets by Gigan and Schumacher puppets that are actually in a way quotating Gigan and Schumacher's puppets that they were using when they were performing. But we are also doing, it's actually an Argentinian artist who is doing the puppets, Ashelen Cocos, and she's doing also 2 smaller puppets of ourselves that are going to be performed by Gigan and Schumacher puppets. So it's
I can hardly wait.
Just a second, how we invite. Okay, Natalia, you can talk. You don't have video. I don't know if you are hearing us now. So we go to Gilad. ¿Cómo lo escribe? Just a second. Okay, Gilad.
Hi, Gilad.
Hi, Barbara and Galit. Thank you for thought-provoking talks and examples. I want to come from the other side, and to do it, I'm going to read something short. And I would like you to think for which exhibition this was written. As the volume goes to press, the United States Custom has refused to permit the Museum of Modern Art to enter as works of art 19 pieces of more or less abstract sculptures under the ruling which require the sculptures must represent an animal or human form. They are all considered dutiable as plaster, bronze, stone, wood, etc., and have been entered under bond. The hand-painted canvases in the exhibition were, however, admitted free as art, no matter how abstract. Anybody knows what show we're talking?
I remember this passage. I can't remember which exhibition.
Sounds like Picasso.
This is the perhaps most famous modern art exhibition in the first half of the 20th century, Cubism and Abstract Art. And this is the only remark that Alfred Barr has added as a footnote to his famous article and chart. And I mention it because I think one of the issues that come up is the status of these objects, which the word status was complicated by the fact that modern art introduced objects that are not clearly art. They don't represent themselves as art. And I think this is why when I think Barbara ended her talk, or in the middle of her talk, she wasn't sure where did it go in the museum. And the museum itself was so confused about the statue of these objects. And I think to come back to the word contemporary, a lot of contemporary art or a lot of contemporary museums, exhibition spaces, is dealing with these issues of not having to label the objects and images that they bring in as one thing or another, which is a pre-modern condition. Pre-modern art, objects didn't have to declare themselves as one thing or another. It is with modern art that the separation became so clear. And this is why this kind of passage was so confusing to the United States Customs on one hand, and the sukkah was so confusing to the museum in 2010 or 12, coming from the other side. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gilad, really. And now we read Natalia Romik's question because she can't talk. Now we understood that. So first of all, she thanks Galit and Barbara for those amazing talks. And for Barbara, what is the difference between doubling and copying in the frames of economic value of art? And the second, related to her practice, if she may call the Bima design in the Bima design in Chmielnik, the glass structure, as a practice of materialization of knowledge.
Wow. Okay. Let's see. Well, we should explain that in the synagogue that Natalia is referring to, the very little actually remained except the shell of the building. And so rather than reconstruct in a literal way the design solution, and she was really instrumental in conceptualizing it, was to create a glass version of the Bima. And it's very, on the one hand, it's very, I would say, ghostly. It's like a phantom. And at the same time, quite ethereal or spiritual, or it's a very, very interesting object. So here, again, I think of it as an iteration rather than as doubling or copying. I think of it as an iteration, a different way of instantiating the, if you will, the idea of the Bima without it being, quote, the Bima. So I don't know that that will necessarily really exhaust what should be said about it, what could and should be said about it. Tell me the first question again.
What is the difference between doubling and copying in the frames of economic value of art?
Well, you know, it depends, because I think that there's a difference between copying, which I would call, let's call it naive, not as a criticism, but as a description. Not as a criticism, but simply, I have an original, I am, quote, making a copy, whether it's painting by the yard or it's whatever it might be. In such an instance, there is no question on the art market that the original has greater value than the copy. There might be exceptions, but I think generally that would be the case. But when the so-called copy, which is, I would say, rather primitive language for the object, but when the copy is a self-conscious, when the copy is an object that is in a, if you will, self-conscious relationship to the prototype, then it might have greater value, in fact, than what it is, quote, a copy of. So I think that, I think we'd have to take specific cases to really be able to get at it.
Thank you very much.
And if there is another question also, we have a question from Yael Wyszynski-Levy for us.
Okay.
That perhaps I read it. The moment when the Jalin house penetrates the white cube of the museum, the border between art and life, as Professor Kirshenblatt-Gimblett mentioned, is blended but not fully. Although, and perhaps because there was a transactional exchange and all cards exposed, there are post-colonial associations and implications that cannot be overlooked. I was hoping to hear a little more about your relationship with the family from whom you bought the structure, and also to ask if there is any educational program that is available for those who visit the construction in the museum to learn about the struggles of the Jalin. Thank you, Yael. So, yes, of course.
Oh, no, contesta.
You.
You.
Of course, that those implications are not overlooked, and they are part of the work. Regarding our relationship, we continue to be in contact, and before the sukkah was bought by the museum, we also had a conversation with like 30 or 40 members of the family to see if that's something that they would like to.
If they agree, actually, to the selling.
To the selling, and also exposing the whole process. And they said that yes, absolutely, but they want also to be mentioned that it's structures that belong to the Jalin, and that's part of our contract with the museum that has to be written, and also the video where Abu Suleiman tells the story of the Al-Korshan family and the Jalin. Regarding the educational program.
No, I want to add, there is also the text, that is a short text, because at the Israel Museum they don't used to put long text. So there is also it was actually the 13 minutes video inside the sukkah, where people were actually seeing not only the documentation of the process, but also their story, Abu Suleiman telling about their story of being expelled from Arad, from the south of Israel, and actually he's telling the story. Also, yes, we wanted to add.
Also, after these projects also evolve into the Delar Sukkah, but also a project of ecotourism that the family developed in the desert, and we were also being part of it. And
no, it's important maybe to mention, because actually the amount that the museum paid for the sukkah, the half of the amount that went to the Jalin family, was used to develop an ecotourism project at the same spot from where the sukkah was taken. There they actually installed inside the structure a typical Bedouin, what they call the typical Bedouin tent for tourists, in order actually to tell about their heritage for Western visitors that come there. And besides that, we are also doing some different activities with them, like some art workshops that we were asked to provide after their visit to the museum. So they say we would like to have some workshops of art for our kids. So we organized workshops, brought some theater also for the kids.
Yeah,
ones.
And especially developing the ecotourism, all the design and the website, etc. And also regarding the educational program at the museum, when the structure was exhibited, so there were the tours, and we were surprised of how the guides were saying actually that the Bedouin, they don't have the same rights as the Jewish Israeli population in Israel, that they are treated as the Bedouin problem. So it was quite a political stance also that the guides were taking while showing the work that was also.
We're taking agency, also the guides by themselves. We don't know what was the text that actually the Israel Museum was expecting to be told, but actually they have the freedom to tell their story, and that's the story we heard. And also the visit of the Jalin was organized also as a consequence of a request by Abu Suleiman to invite the kids to visit the museum, and actually they finished the visit into their own structure.
And the symposium itself that was held in the museum with people from BIMCOM and with Abu Suleiman, and also Dafna Ben Shaul and Rachel Elior, and also the lawyer that advocates for the Jalin. Yeah. So we hope.
That's something. The idea of performance objects was mentioned by Barbara, and I think basically all objects are performance objects, even if the only performance that they perform is hanging on a wall, right? So that's a performance too. It's a minimal performance, but it's performance. But I think the kind of art that you make, the kind of art that you perform, that you show, is that it makes transparent the performative aspects, but it also lays bare the narrative aspect, the story of how the objects have been retrieved, found, created, traveling, etc., etc. The story is part of the art. You can't disconnect the not the dancer and the dance, as Yeats says, but the narrative and the object. You can't
but it's not all,
take them apart.
It's not only the object itself, is what happens with it and in connection with the object itself. Actually, during a story that actually happened when we organized the symposium, we were sitting in the sukkah talking with Abu Suleiman and another member of his family, and the curators of the, I think he was Amitai Mendelssohn, the curator of Israeli art, and the Mira Lapidot, the chief curator at that time, came to greeting Abu Suleiman, and when she entered the sukkah, he came and he told her, "Welcome home." And so that's a very short performance that was able to make upside down all the relation between who is the owner of the place and who is hosting whom. It's also part of the history of the object itself. It's also maybe important to mention that also the curators of the Israeli Museum went to Han al-Ahmar to visit the family. They heard also their story, and it's also part of the project.
If I can just say that what I like very much about this way of working is that these objects, pardon me, tell a story. They are also inside a story, and that narrative is integral to what they are, to what they mean, and that the story's not over, that it's an ongoing story, that it's an open narrative. Why I like that very much is because it is a very important alternative to what I think of as a very weak concept, and that is the concept of context. Because context is usually a residual category for whatever it is that you couldn't figure out how to say, or that isn't somehow rather integral to what it is you're providing context for. And so I think of the videos that you've created, all the materials, I don't think of them as context for something called the object, because what you've created is a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk where all of the elements are the work. There is no residual category called context. It's the whole thing is the work. It's the diary, the video, the photographs, the physical objects, everything is the work. That I think is enormously powerful.
And also the Museum of the Contemporary.
Yeah, exactly. There's no piece of this that is outside the work. There is no need for, no place for something called context.
This is, I think, why paradox is such an important figure in all art, I think, but again, made transparent in the art of the Museum of the Contemporary, because by definition, a Museum of the Contemporary is a contradiction in terms, right? Or should be, but it isn't. So the paradox made to the topic of the art becomes very strong. And that makes the kind of art able to take care of such complex ethical, political, and emotional issues. Just the fact that paradox is made so explicit. That the paradox is not something that you wipe away, but you rather put it in the forefront. And so it can bear the enormous weight of the political the historical, the personal in the kind of art that they make.
Absolutely. And the element of irony is also very important, that the attitude, there's no it's not sentimental, it's not, in other words, it could easily be sentimental, nostalgic, self-righteous, empathetic, in other words, it could be soft, it could be really soft, and but rather there's an element of irony, and there's also an element of critique, but done in a way that's not confrontational, so that it can be it can be rather more by invitation to engage than confrontation to distance. So I think that sort of from a rhetorical point of view, the work is really interesting too.
So we are quite past of time. There is just a last Simon Lichtman. He wanted to say something about.
Hi, Simon.
Hi, Simon.
Simon, so
Hi.
please.
Yeah, I have to.
Yes, Simon.
Yeah,
Lichtman. Yes.
Right, Lichtman. Sure. But no, I wanted to just say something about, well, it's really in relation to Tanya Zimmerman's comment about icons. And I was thinking about performance objects. And Barbara, you just talked about the invitation to engage. So with an icon, through meditation and contemplation, basically they're used to bring you into the moment of Jesus, you could say, either specific moments like the Annunciation, or a general moment, redemption, the possibility of redemption. So what about the Bedouin tent? That's what I was thinking. So here I am now in the Israel Museum looking at this Bedouin tent. There's a performer, the audience or the congregation, or the visitor, the viewer, we have a performance too. So with iconography, with the religious iconography, I suppose it's quite obvious. But the Bedouin tent, where is that taking me? And I suppose it's taking me into a visual connection to the plight of Bedouin society within Israel. And then as you say, Diego, both of you, if you say that the guides specifically referred to that, so it wasn't just a question of me or us in a museum looking at it. We've also got that kind of commentary, and you've always got meta commentary, around the museum walls. It just struck me as being a lovely juxtaposition of the religious Christian iconography and the Bedouin tent in the museum. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think I only would like to add that actually when we are talking about the Bedouin tent, it's not a Bedouin tent, it's actually representing the result of their way of living because of the political situation of Israel regarding the Bedouin situation. So it is including in itself it's not the Bedouin tent, it's the Bedouin tent that it's the only possible way of living that remains to them what is being represented. So it's mirroring the Israeli politics regarding their way of living. And at the same time they were showing in their own touristic project what they consider the original tent, the typical tent.
Sure.
So I think that
okay, I think that we've been 2 hours right now. So thank you again, Galit and Barbara. We have no words. Also we have so many things to think about after this talk, and thank you for taking part and for accepting to come this evening to the virtual salon at the Soberman's house. And thank you to all the public that join us. And Diego, would you like to say something?
No,
else?
thank you. We are really happy. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you really for your great talks. And
thank you.
And when we will open the museum, you are welcome to come and visit.
Always.
Physically again. So
Well,
See you soon. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
sacar el spotlight. ¿Cómo apago?